In 1897, Bram Stoker wrote the novel Dracula, giving readers and later filmmakers the most iconic figure in Gothic literature, the vampire. Dracula is a Victorian high-tech thriller at the cutting edge of science, filled with concepts like dictation to phonographic cylinders, blood transfusions, shorthand, and trepanning. It features a cast of stout heroes and beautiful doomed women, and it's told entirely in letters, telegrams, press cuttings, and the like. None of the people who are telling us the story knows the entirety of what is actually going on. This means that Dracula is a book that forces the reader to fill in the blanks, to hypothesize, to imagine, and to presume. We know only what the characters know, and the characters neither write down all they know nor know the significance of what they do tell. So it's up to the reader to decide what's happening in Whitby, to connect Renfield's rants and behavior in the asylum with the events that happen in the house next door, to decide what Dracula's true motives are. It's also up to the reader to decide whether Van Helsing knows anything about medicine, whether Dracula crumbles to dust at the end, or even, given the combination of kukri knife and bowie knife that unconvincingly finishes a vampire off, whether he simply transmutes into fog and vanishes. The story is built up in broad strokes, allowing us to build up our picture of what's happening. The story spiderwebs, and we begin to wonder what occurs in the interstices. At the beginning of the story, we find Jonathan Harker visiting Dracula in his homeland of Romania. The castle lies deep in the Carpathian Mountains of Transylvania. This setting is filled with superstition, creepy, frightening landscape, all of the elements that we might find in our stereotypical Gothic story. Because the elements of Gothic literature are so clear in this, I'd like for us to take a closer look at sexuality found in the work. Several of the interpretations of Dracula either explicitly or implicitly indicate a sexual interpretation. And if we want to take a look at something called the Oedipus complex, Dracula is a quite blatant demonstration of this complex, a kind of incestuous, necrophilous, oral, anal, sadistic, all-in wrestling match, says Maurice Richardson. To go a little farther with this and take a look at some specific examples, let's look at some of the characters. So, the facile and stereotypical dichotomy between the dark woman and the fair, the fallen, and the idealized is obvious in Dracula. Indeed, among the more gratuitous passages in the novel are those in which the new woman who is sexually aggressive is verbally assaulted. So Mina Harker remarks that such a woman whom she holds in contempt will do the proposing herself when, for instance, when Lucy is talking about which man to choose. Additionally, we must compare Van Helsing's hope that there are good women still left in life to make happy with Mina's assertion that the world seems full of good men even if there are monsters in it. This is a remarkable contrast. So perhaps nowhere is this dichotomy of sensual and sexless women more dramatic than it is in Dracula, and nowhere is the suddenly sexual woman more violently and self-righteously persecuted than in Stoker's thriller. This equation of vampirism with sexuality is well established in this interpretation. Freud's observation that morbid dread always signifies repressed sexual wishes has us have to agree that Dracula is permeated with morbid dread. However, another tone interrupts the dread of impending doom throughout the novel. That note is on lustful anticipation. Certainly anticipation of catching and destroying forever the master vampire, Dracula, is additionally lustful anticipation of a consummation one can only describe as sexual. One thinks, for example, of the candle's sperm, which dropped in white patches on Lucy's coffin as Van Helsing opens it for the first time. In another place we have Jonathan Harker when he meets the three vampire women, whose relation to Dracula is incestuous, whose appeal is described almost pornographically. Here's the line: all three had brilliant white teeth and shone like pearls against the ruby of their voluptuous lips. There was something about them that made me uneasy, some longing, and at the same time deadly fear. I felt in my heart a wicked burning desire that they would kiss me with those red lips. So Jonathan is an agony of delightful anticipation, and at the very end of the novel, Van Helsing falls prey to the same attempted seduction by the three vampires. Two more scenes that are a bit sexual. The first is Lucy when she's laid to rest by Arthur, and then later Lord Godalming, which is worth taking a look at, says, Arthur placed the point of the stake over the heart, and as I looked, I could see its dent in the white flesh. Then he struck with all his might. The thing in the coffin writhed, and a hideous blood-curdling screech came from the open red lips. The body shook and quivered and twisted in wild contortions. The sharp white teeth champed together till the lips were cut, and the mouth was smeared with crimson foam. But Arthur never faltered. He looked like a figure of Thor, and his untrembling arm rose and fell, driving deeper and deeper the mercy-bearing stake, while else, the blood from the pierced heart welled and spurted up again. So such a description needs no comment here, it's fairly obvious. But let's take a look at the scene later that's looked as maybe a bit primal in oral terms, and this is when Dracula slits open his breast and forces Mina to drink. With his left hand he held both Miss Harker's hands, keeping them away with her arms at full tension. His right hand gripped her by the back of the neck, forcing her face down on his bosom. Her white nightdress was smeared with blood, and a thin stream trickled down the man's bared chest, which was shown by his torn open dress. The attitude of the two had a terrible resemblance to a child forcing a kitten's nose into a saucer of milk to compel it to drink. So these are, in the main, the only sexual scenes and descriptions in the novel, and not only are the scenes heterosexual, some are incestuous, especially when taken together. Later, we have Van Helsing's warning to Seward not to tell Arthur that anyone else has given Lucy blood, and this indicates the sexual nature of the operation of the blood transfusions. Furthermore, Arthur himself feels that as a result of having given Lucy his blood, they are in effect married. Thus, the friendships of the novel mask a deep-seated rivalry and hostility, and again an incestuousness. To shift just a little, we can look at Lucy and Mina being essentially the same figure, the mother figure. So Dracula is in fact the same story told twice with different outcomes. In the former, the mother is more desirable, more sexual, more threatening, and must be destroyed, and the physical descriptions of Lucy reflect this greater ambivalence early in the story, when Lucy's not yet vampirized. Dr. Seward describes her hair in its usual sunny ripples. Later, the men watch her return to her tomb. Lucy is described as a dark-haired woman. The conventional fair-dark split, symbolic of respective moral caste, seems to be unconscious here, reflecting the ambivalence aroused by the sexualized female. So not only is Lucy the more sexualized figure, she is the more rejecting figure, rejecting 2 of 3 sons in the novel. So this time, in dealing with Mina, the mother is much less sexually threatening and is ultimately saved. So Mina is never described physically and is the opposite of rejecting. All of the men become her sons, symbolizing by the naming of her actual son after all of them. What remains constant is the attempt to destroy the mother. What changes is the way the fantasies are managed. To speak of the novel in terms of the child's ambivalence toward the mother is not just to speak psychoanalytically. We need only recall that Lucy, as Bloofer Lady, as well as the other vampire women, prey on children. In the case of Lucy, the children are as attracted to her as threatened by her. So, looking at Mina, she is all good, all pure, all true. When, however, she is seduced away from the straight and narrow by Dracula, she is unclean, tainted and stained, with a mark on her forehead immediately occasioned by Van Helsing touching her forehead with the host. And let's go back to that scene with Mina. In this case, the woman is doing the sucking, and the reader by this point in the novel has become used to Dracula doing the sucking, but not to Dracula being sucked, specifically at the breast. While it is true that the reader may most often think of Dracula as the active partner, the fact is that the scenes of vampire sexuality are described from the male perspective, with the females as active assailants. Only the acts of phallic aggression, the killings, involve the males in active roles. And if we finally get to the end, the novel has it both ways. Dracula is destroyed and Van Helsing saved. Lucy is destroyed and Mina is saved. The novel ends on a rather ironic note, given our understanding here, as Harker concludes with a quote from the good Father Van Helsing: "We want no proofs, we ask none to believe us. This boy will someday know what a brave and gallant woman his mother is. Already he knows her sweetness and loving care. Later on he will understand how some men so loved her that they did dare so much for her sake." So again, we do have a bit of an Oedipal complex going on in this story, if we want to take a look at Freudian psychology. But again, that is simply one line of analysis. Psychology itself does play a major role in this, specifically through Van Helsing's perspective. And we have to ask the question about Dracula's maturity. Though Dracula has lived so many years, has he actually progressed mentally, or does he still have a child's mind? Which is something that Van Helsing explores. Something else to look at in this novel is the difference between Eastern and Western culture. Dracula himself represents Eastern culture, whereas the other characters represent Western. So what happens when you have someone from Eastern culture planted in a Westernized culture? That's another form of analysis that you can take here. But overall, this novel does establish the foundational elements of the vampire. It's by no means the first vampire novel or the first story to deal with vampirism. However, it is certainly the most popular and most adapted vampire work, and is often thought of as the iconic vampire novel, similar to The Castle of Otranto being the foundational Gothic novel.